is Ticky Fullerton on Your Money.
Hello there, I'm Ticky Fullerton, every night bringing you a full hour of the very best in business coverage across the nation and internationally, especially where business and politics meet. Well, coming up, the Wesfarmers' attempted takeover of Lynas heats up. Lynas CEO Amanda Lacaze is standing by to give us her thoughts on the situation. One of the most powerful people at Microsoft globally is in Australia, and he responds to Facebook's decision to ban white supremacist content in a very in-depth interview. My interview with Microsoft President and Head of Legal Brad Smith a little later in the show. And the challenges ahead for Australia's agriculture sector. I'll be speaking with Robobank's global chairman of the board, Wiebe Draijer. Well, let's start now with what is turning out to be one of the biggest surprise M&A stories of the year. Earlier this week, analysts and commentators were shocked to hear that ASX behemoth Wesfarmers had made a $1.5 billion bid for rare earth miner Lynas. Wesfarmers CEO Rob Scott saying, quote, "An investment in Lynas leverages our unique assets and capabilities, including chemical processing, and will deliver Lynas shareholders with an attractive premium and certain cash return." Well, the bid was ultimately rebuffed, with Lynas, the board, saying the deal did not do justice to the value of the company. Lynas is a unique company, and its value is derived from its strong, irreplaceable assets, including Lynas's unique position as the only significant rare earths miner and processor outside China. Well, to make their position on the offer perfectly clear, the Lynas board chose not to engage with Wesfarmers and recommended that shareholders take no action at all. But that didn't stop Wesfarmers there, it appears. Today, we read reports that they've gone over the top of Lynas to engage directly with the Malaysian authorities over the future of its controversial processing plant. More specifically, they've apparently given details to the Malaysian government about what they might be able to bring to the table if they gained control of Lynas. Well, what does Lynas think about all this? Well, for more, I'm delighted to welcome Lynas Chief Executive Amanda Lacaze, who is in Sydney at the moment. Amanda, thank you very much for joining us there. Now, can we just walk back a moment? Can we understand exactly why Wesfarmers would think Lynas might be a good asset in their portfolio?
Absolutely, because Lynas is a good asset. Lynas is a unique company with three pieces that, as an old marketer, I call unique competitive advantage. Our ore body at Mount Weld is a true tier 1 resource. It is high grade, it is long life, it has over 25-year life. And when we're exposed to the sort of growth markets that we are, the technology markets which are growing, for example, electrification of vehicles, that mine life is really important. The second thing that we have is that we have IP. Separating and processing rare earths is not something that you can pick up a textbook and work out how to do it. And we have developed unique IP within our company with respect to this, and it is IP that is only resident in Lynas outside of China. And that brings me to the final point, which is that we have a unique market position as the only non-Chinese supplier of these materials.
Right, so if you're a shareholder in Lynas, I mean, some of the commentators, I have to say, they were very taken aback at this news, but they were sort of saying, oh, well, look, Lynas has got also this sovereign risk attached to it around what happens with the processing plant up in Malaysia. We've been following it with you as you've been walking this tightrope. Why don't you just take the money? Because the share price has gone up a bit. Take the money.
I think what's really important to note is there is no bid and there is actually no offer. There's a proposal to talk. And so there is nothing to say, take the money. And certainly the proposal to talk comes with very, very a highly it's a highly conditional proposal to talk even. I would say that Wesfarmers are looking to acquire the asset at a risk-weighted price, but they would like the risk to actually be removed before they purchase the asset.
Right, indeed. Now, you were pretty forthright in your response on this. You actually called them arrogant.
Well, I think that it's a risk for big companies always, and I did talk a little bit about that, and I've spent most of my career working in very large companies. I understand the culture of large companies. I also have been fortunate to work in some smaller companies, including the one I lead today. And we are able to do things because we are fleet of foot. We are agile. We do things a little differently. So last year we delivered at what we called Lynas Next, which was a 40% upgrade in capacity, and we did it at a number that generally large companies probably would have spent on an engineering firm doing a study.
Yes. So, Amanda, you know, clearly there was some sort of partnership that you were exploring with Wesfarmers. Now, something went wrong there. Was that because it was your understanding that they wouldn't want any kind of control?
Oh, look, it went like this. It was back in August last year, I remember, because I took I think it was an email or a call when I was at Diggers and Dealers, and it was from one of the Wesfarmers executives who said, look, you know, we'd really like to have a chat, and we're interested in rare earths, and you've got a Western Australian resource, and we're a Western Australian company.
Yeah.
And you know, Ticky, we're a friendly lot at Lynas. And in fact, we're very proud of what we do. And we said, sure, come and let's have a talk. Anyway, so they came along and they talked to us about, you know, maybe there'd be opportunities to partner, to do things that could create additional value. And we said, yes, sure, well, let's talk about that. It became clear as we were going on that we were talking about partnership and they were not. And when that became very clear, we said, oh, look, you know, really, we don't want to talk any longer.
So you saw that as a real bait and switch?
Yeah, I see it a bit like they've asked the girl to the dance, but the girl's supposed to organise the car and buy the chap's suit at the same time.
So interestingly, there are reports, Paul Garvey was reporting that perhaps Wesfarmers, well, it's understood that Wesfarmers has actually been talking to the Malaysian government, perhaps suggesting that they can solve their problems of the plant, some of this radioactive material, by winding it back into Western Australia. Now, presumably, if that happened and they took it over, they wouldn't need a Malaysian resident running the joint like yourself, would they?
Yeah, well, so I think it's an interesting concept. I'm not sure how Wesfarmers would feel if I went and spoke to others about their business, right? So I'm not quite sure on what basis they make representations,
yes,
given that they don't actually have access to the details that would be required within the business to make representations on which anyone could rely. So I really don't understand this, and as you said, it's a media report.
Yes. But Amanda, this is really interesting because I was going to say the sensitivity there obviously is the radioactive element there, but there's no talk about presumably what you are talking to the Malaysians about, which is the jobs and the investment that you are offering in Malaysia, and presumably the government is quite interested in that. I mean, if this is true about Wesfarmers, they are blowing up your negotiations, aren't they?
Well, maybe. I actually have greater faith in, you know, sort of some of the very wise heads in the Malaysian government. And certainly the Malaysian government's goal is to improve the economy and to improve the living conditions of Malaysians. They look for foreign direct investors who are going to assist them to do that, and who can be part of a forward-looking economic strategy. Lynas fits the bill. We run an an operation which is safe for our people, the communities and the environment. But as well as that, we also we employ 2.7% of the Kuantan employed workforce. Our workforce earns 4 times the median salary in Kuantan, and that's not because we overpay, that's because they are skilled and highly skilled jobs.
Yes.
We train our people, we are bringing IP and we are developing IP in Malaysia, and we help to make Malaysia famous as the only place producing rare earths.
So this is obviously on the side where you're trying to convince the Malaysian government to extend your licence, which presumably runs out in, I think, September. Looking at what happened in terms of the board buying shares, I think in that disclosure window after your results, they've all doubled down. So presumably they feel pretty confident in you that you were going to be able to deliver that before September.
So, you know, I think it's really important to note that when we released our half-year accounts, it says very clearly, and our board is very aware of our duties under continuous disclosure and our fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders.
Yes.
And after consideration of all elements, we, the board, decided it was appropriate to release our accounts on a going concern basis. Once we had released our half-year accounts, we had provided all of those updates. As far as we were concerned, the market was cleansed and we opened, and our trading windows for our staff are very short trading windows. I think in this instance it was maybe only a week.
Yes.
Some of our directors decided that they would purchase shares during that time.
And clearly
and
that
I'm
has
not
nothing.
assuming that they did that because they thought they'd lose money.
But clearly, I mean, I've just got to ask this just to square it away, but clearly there was no question that there was a Wesfarmers bid in the background down the track, obviously.
We did not believe so.
Yeah.
We had said to Wesfarmers directly that we felt now was not the right time to engage, and if ever, on what was becoming increasingly apparent was their agenda. And so, given that we had amiable conversations up until that time, we felt that was the end of it. And like you've got friends, and sometimes you don't see each other for a while, sometimes you do.
Yes.
But we were as surprised as anyone else when this arrived on our desks last week.
Okay, so let's assume finally that if the board of directors, or many of them, double down, as I said, on their investments when they had the opportunity to do so, confidence in you, say you pull this off, which will be a terrific achievement if you manage to do it, and then say the share price goes back up, say Wesfarmers still wants you, and say they do take you over, would you be able to work with Rob Scott?
Ticky, it's not about me. Right. One of the things which has been brought home to the Australian corporate community is that every business has many stakeholders. Clearly, as a board, our fiduciary responsibility is to our shareholders, and we would need to consider our response to any offer for the company in those terms. But as well as that, we have many stakeholders. My job is to make sure that I build value in this company, and I add value to for our shareholders, for our people, for our lenders, for our communities, and all our other various stakeholders. And so this has got nothing to do with me and what I might think about it, but it has everything to do with the company.
My goodness, you're going to be busy over the next month or so. Amanda Lacaze, we do thank you for the opportunity.
Not like I wasn't before.
Not like you weren't before, but look, we thank you for the opportunity. It's been great to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ticky. Bye.
After the break, Facebook to ban white supremacist material in the wake of the Christchurch massacre. Is this the right approach? My special interview with Microsoft President Brad Smith next.
You're watching Ticky on Your Money. Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Well, one of the most powerful executives from Microsoft globally has been in Australia and New Zealand in the last few days. Brad Smith is President and Chief Legal Officer for Microsoft, and he has been critical of the government's encryption laws. But importantly, while in the region, he has been very vocal too about the great predicament the tech sector is in post-Christchurch. In a personal blog, he distanced himself from the big FANG companies and suggested a principled, comprehensive and effective industry-wide approach be developed to potentially protect human rights and save human lives. Well, what then to make of news today that Facebook has banned praise, support and representation of white nationalism and separatism? Can we call that a principled, comprehensive and effective approach? Well, for more on this, I spoke with Brad Smith earlier today. Brad Smith, it's great to talk to you in Australia. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
These are extraordinary times, particularly for big tech in America. I want to ask you about the Christchurch event and what made you decide personally to write that blog?
Well, in part it was because I knew I would be in Wellington on Monday and Tuesday of this week. In part it was because of the gravity of the moment. And in part I think it reflects the way the world has changed. You know, really, these events call on us to sort of define what we're going to do and be more public, be more transparent. In this instance, you know, it was important for us to have something that enabled us to decide what we were going to do and then to share it.
Clearly, FANG has come in for a lot of criticism about management of the social platform. Could Microsoft too, which was at the fringes in this whole thing, have done a better job?
Yes, we definitely could have. You know, the good news was our services were really not used to a significant degree to disseminate, you know, what was obviously this horrific, you know, terrorist video. But we quickly sat down and asked, okay, how did we do? Where were there things we could learn? And we've already implemented some changes. But I think more broadly than that, we concluded that we're all just scratching the surface in terms of ideas we need to develop in order to do well. And some of these can be done individually as companies. Some of it needs to be done by the industry working together.
So Facebook has now suggested that it is going to start, you know, banning things. Do you think that's enough of a reaction?
Well, first of all, I think it's a good step. And, you know, I think we should applaud others in the industry when they're taking good steps. But none of us is yet in a position where we can say that we're doing everything that we're going to need to do. And I think, you know, at Facebook, you know, we're certainly hearing that from them as well. We'll have the opportunity to work across the industry. I think we need to act with a sense of urgency. But also some creativity so we can put ourselves on a better path.
So Stephen Shearer, I think former head of Facebook Australia, has actually said this week that the big social media companies can't self-regulate. They're not capable of doing it.
I think that self-regulation can help. But I think the time has come for us to recognize as an industry that it's actually a mistake for us always to be resisting regulation. I believe that there is a role for regulation, including to address this issue. It needs to be thoughtful, it needs to be balanced, not just so that there's a common set of rules for the industry players that are responsible. That's one of the things that regulation does. But there needs to be more effective government action against certain platforms that I look at and I just ask, is this even part of civilization as we want it to be? They're just spreading this hatred.
So, Brad, what would work? I mean, what sort of penalties would work? And what sort of responsibility or lack of responsibility would warrant big government penalties?
Well, the first thing I think one needs to decide is what substantive principles does one want government and regulation to lay down. If you look at radio or you look at television, you know, it starts with a base level of public responsibility that one must assume in order to be part of this marketplace. And yeah, I fully believe that the Googles, the Facebooks, they'll all satisfy those, but it's not clear to me that every entity does, and I think that it should have to if it's going to be part of this market. I think beyond that, there's some specific questions. How quickly does one respond? How should we think about live video? What kind of role do we want it to play on the internet?
At what stage is social media, the big social media companies, at what stage are they going to admit that they are really publishers?
I can't speak for them.
Because that's at the heart of this, isn't it?
It is certainly part of it. I think one should break it into two parts. The first is to address what you just described. The Prime Minister of New Zealand said this week something that I endorsed in our blog. I said, look, the days of thinking that we're just like postal carriers delivering something that someone else has put in an envelope, those days are over. Let's recognize it. Now, that doesn't mean that then you should regulate social media, including like our services like LinkedIn. It doesn't mean we should regulate them the same way we do television or radio. We need a new regime to emerge. But I, for one, say it's time to start constructing the new world because the old one isn't working.
Yeah, for example, in Australia at the moment, we've got a number of individuals who are being threatened with potentially jail time for some of the stuff that they've been doing, publishing in Victoria around George Pell. Now, this is happening in traditional media. Social media have also been involved in that, but they're untouchable.
Yes, and look, I'm not, I didn't come to Australia to advocate for imprisoning tech executives. Yeah. No surprise there. I think that if there's clear rules, if there is regulation put behind it, responsible companies are going to implement them. And therefore I say let's focus on the right model for the future, the right rules for the future. Let's not lose all the value that has been created in this part of the economy and technology, but let's find new approaches that will put it on the path we'll all be more comfortable with.
In the last few years, Microsoft globally has grown to become not only very successful commercially again, but also developing a reputation as a model citizen, somebody who's championing privacy in a way that FANG has not been able to do, which around this issue of trust is so important, one would think. Now, very recently, the GeekWire wrote a very good article, I thought, which was entitled From Evil Empire to Model Citizen, How Microsoft's Good Deeds Work to Its Competitive Advantage. And the writer makes the point that while all your actions ring of altruism and stand to benefit the greater good, they also represent one of the savviest business plays in the tech giant's 43-year history.
I read those things with mixed feelings, in all honesty. And, in a country where people, I think, are rightly wary about tall poppies, we're not trying to grow the tallest poppy in the field. I think we are in a realm where, first, let's face it, there's plenty of money to be made in technology. So let's now figure out how we're going to do the right thing. And I don't think that, the right thing is, something that we're necessarily smarter about than anybody else. There are days when I admire what our competitors or other companies are doing as well. But I also think that, if we try to, have more creativity and just act more decisively to do the right thing, I'm glad that this is a moment in history when people care about companies that do the right thing. I think that should motivate us all to do that.
You must spend a significant amount of one-on-one time with your chief, Satya Nadella. Yeah. Presumably he is very much of this mind as well, that you've got to be contributing to society in this very conscious age of social governance.
Yeah, I do think that it starts, as it always does, at the top of every company. And if there's sort of two things that I find as I hear from Satya, as I talk with Satya, is like, if there's a problem, rather than run away from it, let's lean in and see if we can help solve it. We may not have helped create it, but we can still help solve it. And second, let's see if there's a way to help solve it in a principled way. I think that the world looks at companies, you look at politicians, you look at governments, and you ask, what do they stand for? And you need to know yourself what you stand for. You need to be able to articulate it in a transparent way, and then most importantly, you need to act. But if you can act in a principled way, it gives you the ability to be consistent over time, and that does accrue to hopefully, ensuring that people have a little more confidence or trust in you.
Just one on competition. Between traditional media and again social media. The ACCC, Rod Sims, is running a very important review that I think the whole world is watching. Microsoft has contributed to that review. Now, clearly, again, Microsoft doesn't have a huge amount of ad revenue. It's got LinkedIn, it's got a few things, but your business model doesn't survive around that. Other companies like Facebook and Google, that's very important to them. Where do you sit on how fair this is, and indeed if these sorts of companies need to be broken up to create proper competition?
Well, I don't think the answer is in breaking up companies. We went through this ourselves 20 years ago. But there's a variety of sound, creative regulatory approaches that can be pursued to address issues that people care about.
Is it fair to say, though, that the threat of breakup 20 years ago, when Microsoft was quite dominant, was enough actually to push Microsoft into the sort of remedy that actually then became acceptable?
Whatever the factors were that got us there, I think what was important was that regulators got Microsoft to a position that they felt opened up the market. Yeah. I think the first question that one should always think about is, what problem are we trying to solve? To me, one of the most interesting things about what is happening here in Australia with the ACCC is that people are focused on a problem of profound importance. If you think about what it means to sustain democracy around the world, one of the things that is absolutely indispensable is healthy journalism. Journalism has become less healthy. A lot of that revenue, frankly, has moved over to online platforms. It's moved over to advertising. And democracy is way more important than technology.
But is subsidizing content by tax relief and that sort of stuff going to work, or are you going to have to hit the real issue of the fact that some companies have just got a big share of advertising?
Well, I think the question is, what are the various creative options that exist to solve this problem, to restore more financial health to journalism overall? You can have tax incentives, and you can say, maybe, but maybe not. You can use competition rules. I think before one tries to say, here is the answer, one is best served by putting together a menu of options and having a conversation about them.
Finally, can I ask you, here we are sitting in the middle of an election campaign in Australia. Cybersecurity is so important at the moment. What is Microsoft doing with its Defending Democracy team?
Well, we have a Defending Democracy team that's working here in Australia and in a number of other countries. And specifically, what we're trying to bring to the candidates, to the political parties, free of charge, is advanced threat intelligence to protect them from nation-state hacking, from other threats that we've seen in so many other electoral cycles in so many other countries.
Including America.
The United States. We've seen it most recently in Western Europe. We saw it 2 years ago in France. Wherever there is an election, unfortunately, we find some nation-state attackers showing up. So we're very focused on doing what we can here. And then we're also very focused on longer-term efforts, because we think we need to protect not only candidates but voting. And we need to take some effective action to address the disinformation campaigns that really seek to almost suck the vitality and citizen confidence out of our fundamental democratic processes. So I think we need to regard this as a very, very important priority. We'll all be talking about it in Australia in the coming weeks and months, but it is an issue that needs to be addressed in the months and years that follow as well.
Brad Smith, so interesting to get your insights. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
After the break, we'll discuss the outlook for the agricultural sector with Robobank's global chairman, Wiebe Draijer. Next.
This is Ticky on Your Money, covering the big business stories.
Yes, welcome back. British MPs' efforts to find a new Brexit plan have failed spectacularly this morning. All 8 proposed options were rejected in a series of historic votes. Everything's historic over there at the moment. And now Prime Minister Theresa May has promised she'll resign if MPs back her twice rejected deal.
Parliament doesn't do this very often. No binary choices, but instead a menu of options from which MPs could make up a meal. Parliamentarians were allowed to choose any and all of the Brexit choices they liked and which they could live with.
Confirmatory public vote. The ayes were 268. Yes! The noes were 295. Yes!
And the answer was they couldn't live with anything. Nothing got a majority, not one of the options. For the engineers of this scheme, it was a blow.
It is, of course, a very great disappointment that the House has not chosen to find a majority for any proposition.
Although there was no majority for anything, Remainers have some reason for cheer. The idea of a permanent customs union and a confirmatory referendum on any deal got more votes than the PMs on either outing. And full-blown revocation of Article 50, nowhere just a few weeks ago won support from nearly a third of the Commons.
What's clear is what the most popular options are in Parliament from tonight, and top of the list was putting this issue back to the people. It's very clear. It got more votes than the Prime Minister's deal got, in fact, which I think is very significant.
The question now is what the Commons does next with these votes. It looks likely they will try and whittle down the options further on Monday, but even if a majority can be achieved, the government might not accept them. And then talk is of MPs trying to compel the government through law, which is harder than just taking control of the timetable. One thing is clear, the parliamentary process is unable to handle Brexit, or at least this undecided parliament cannot. It looks increasingly likely then that the people, through an election or a referendum, will have to decide for them.
Well, in the meantime, the EU has responded with leaders shocked and dismayed at the result, with President of the European Council Donald Tusk going a step further, reminding British lawmakers they still have the option of cancelling Brexit altogether.
Now, back to Ticky.
Yeah, welcome back. And it was quite a morning this morning at the Farm Summit, the Robobank Farm to Fork Summit. I was down there with 1,300 people on Cockatoo Island for the annual summit, and 900 of the 1,300 were actually farmers. They left their properties around Australia for it and gathered on the island to hear from innovators, scientists, politicians and business leaders. I just tell you, it was pretty cool. Look, the Dutch headquartered Robobank has been for a long time a friend to the Australian agriculture business as part of its $160 billion global agriculture portfolio, with $100 billion, I think, in private sector lending to food and agriculture. This year, the bank's top dog, its chairman of the managing board, Wiebe, Draijer, opened the conference, and he's actually just come from there now, and delighted to say he joins me. Wiebe, great to have you at the desk.
Thanks for having me.
Now, look, it was so funny this morning. You had those 2 border collies come up, and one of them actually walked up and gave you an akubra, so I hope you've taken it home with you.
I hope I can take it home with me. It was wonderful. Yeah, and it fitted myself. I have a big head, so
well, you said
that happens.
You said you see Rabo and the bank as a bit of a border collie. You are an unusual bank. People think of the big 4 banks and lending or not lending to farmers down here, but of course Rabo has quite a special relationship with farmers.
Well, we come from a farming background. We are a cooperative bank stemming from nearly 120 years back in the Netherlands, where richer farmers pooled their resources to help poorer farmers step up the investment chain and move on. And the bank has evolved from that. I lead it now 4 years, and well, we've done the same thing in Australia, New Zealand, and in other parts where agriculture plays an important role.
Yeah, so you're Australia, New Zealand, Europe, but you're also in Brazil or
we are, yeah.
Africa.
We're all over the food supply chain around the world.
Yeah.
We serve 5 million smallholder farmers in Africa to help them go through the same cycle that we did 120 years ago in the Netherlands and ever since.
I thought it was a very interesting message that you had this morning at this time of ESG investing, particularly on the social side, that you were sort of pitching yourselves to those listening as very much the co-op mentality.
Yes.
And that it's a good fit in terms of your relationship with the farmer.
Well, look, what the agricultural sector has done, and farmers in Australia and New Zealand in particular, and also in the Netherlands, they have been on a very successful development over the last 40 years, and they have stepped up productivity enormously, and they're now the source of feeding the world. And Australia has a big ticket to do that. But also they moved into territory where they now are facing some practices that they didn't intend, but we now know with the world that we're in that we have to change those. They need to move to more sustainable practices, and those changes lend themselves in a way for the same contribution and collaborative or cooperative approach as we've done in the past. So I approached them as members of a cooperative and said, we need you.
So I'll come to some of those challenges in a minute, but really interesting, you made the point as well about the size of Australia's potential arable land compared to what we're doing with it now, and the share that we have of that land in the world.
Yes. So Australia has 0.3% of the world's population and 5% of the arable land today.
5% of today's arable land in the world is in Australia?
So
that's
you have
amazing.
The best place to play a role in the next round of the food supply to the world. But we are short arable land in the world, and we can't continue to chop down forests. So we have to find a more sustainable way of doing it. Australia has it. How can we make the transition so that you play that stage in the next round, the next 10, 20, 30 years as we go to 2050, and we collectively have to feed 10 billion people in a more sustainable way. That's the challenge. I think Australia has this card. We now hopefully can help make that play.
So some of these challenges, I was quite shocked to hear from Data 61, CSIRO, just how challenging climate change is for farming in Australia.
Yes, so I've been traveling from Brisbane inwards to Roma, and then traveled some of the properties of larger farmers and seen firsthand what it does. But you could also see that you have farmers that treat it respectively, and you could see the land of farmers that do it very consciously. The land looks still relatively vibrant despite the lack of rain and water for so long. And then you have others where they're more driving it off over intensively using the land, and that's now barren nearly. I think that's an example of what needs to happen in the next phase, is that responsible use of land so that it is able to regenerate with the first drop is what's really needed in the phase to come. But climate extreme events are going to play an important role.
What about the social pressures? You were up on that farm in Roma, and you said there were actually protesters there. What were they protesting about?
Well, not when I was there, but the week before they were there, and they were activists with a vegan entity or orientation, saying we should stop eating meat as the whole world.
So this is not an anti-gas thing or anything like that. No, this is literally, no, we shouldn't be eating meat.
Yeah, and this is just one expression of consumer behavior. You have others that said we need to cut down on meat a little bit, and the other saying, well, we need to reduce the emissions that agriculture. There is societal pressure, and I think that's part of the things that farmers now need to embrace, to say, we won the round one, how can we win round two, which is a more sustainable farming practice around the world?
Wiebe, something that farmers in Australia are really worried about, I know, is access to credit.
Yes.
Now, when I spoke to the Agriculture Minister, David Littleproud, a little while ago, he was last week, he actually came out against government policy which was responding to the terrible floods we've had in the north. The government moved in and announced that they would be making sure that the big banks lent to farmers willy-nilly and with a minimum foreclosure period of 3 years. Now, he was concerned about that as the Agriculture Minister because he felt it meant that banks couldn't be selective on credit, and it actually might restrict their willingness to lend to the agriculture sector. What do you think about that?
Well, a couple of things. One is that I've seen similar policies applied in other countries after a extreme weather condition, and although the intention of those policies typically is good, we need to help the farmers in the worst possible period, and we do as a cooperative bank. But the by-effects, the side effects of some of these policies are sometimes more severe than the intent. And for example, one of the effects could be that farmers that are close to being in a difficult spot already they would take the benefit of the 3 years, and that undermines then the cycle shift that the sector has to go through. Difficult language for sometimes restructuring happens on the back of these extreme climate events. The trick is we as private sector need to step in and help the farmers that can best be used and best be helped.
Yes.
But also be socially responsible for those that were already close to stepping out or in succession changes, using this occasion to help them. And I have sympathy for this reflection, saying be cognizant of those kind of interventions, because what it does, it makes an exit difficult, and other banks might therefore be hesitant to step in precisely for that reason, that the protection keeps them from getting out when that's what a bank does. We as a cooperative bank have a longer term intention in mind, and we typically stick around when it's tough. That's what's our calling card. But I have sympathy for a sector that tends to step out earlier in those cases.
One of the big discussion points today, which I don't think comes up highly enough, is all about waste.
Yes.
And what can be done with waste.
Yeah. Well, let me do the big picture on waste, because it is a big problem for the planet. And of all the food we eat, add another 50, that's what we waste. It's either at the production side, at the farmer level, or it's on the consumption side, at home when we buy food and we toss it away, or in the supermarket when it gets tossed away before use. A third of the food that gets produced gets lost. And it's one of the biggest things that we can do to reduce greenhouse emissions is to reduce back on waste. And we issued a report today about the situation of waste in Australia. And the good news is that actually it's gone down. It was about consumer behavior and consumer waste. It's gone down, and consumers in Australia have wasted less money, less food in the last year than they did before, but we're still far away from a sustainable way of doing it and not wasting anything at all. And so this is something that we think is important to the planet, to Australia, to farmers, but to consumers too. It actually saves you a lot of money if you would not spend the money on the food that you're wasting.
Yes.
Adds up to roughly about $1,000 per capita per year. Yes. And that's a lot of money. So
I thought one of the most impactful presentations you had this morning was Krista Watkins and what she's doing with wasted green bananas, which essentially triggered this business, this value-add business, which creates powdered essentially powdered bananas, but powdered all sorts of things, powdered fruits and everything else. And of course, all these sort of, young, fit-conscious people now want them in smoothies. And so they're just racing out the supermarkets. Yeah, so the industry of waste is actually a good industry. Every dollar invested in waste is earned back 15 or 14 times. So if you come up with a business plan that has to deal with waste or can deal with it, it's good business. The tricky part is to find those niches where you can actually do it. And you see great examples. You can see restaurants that are on the back of retail stores that serve you food that would otherwise go wasted. It's perfect food. There is a factory that we finance which does tomato soup from wasted tomatoes. It's perfectly eatable. And so if we can find those applications, I think we would make the world a better place, and we would reduce the cost of waste. Wiebe, I hope you do get your hat back.
I hope so too. Thank you
and thank you so much for coming down and at the conference, and also coming in here. Great to talk.
Thank you.
After the break, it was a big night on the social calendar last night. Margin Calls Will Glasgow will join me next to recap the last night's Sydney Institute dinner.
Now, back to Ticky.
Yes, welcome back, and let's finish with a bit of gossip now. Last night was the night of nights for the Conservative political community. It was the Sydney Institute's annual dinner. It's actually its 30th annual dinner. It was packed with the who's who in politics and business. For more on what went on, pleased to welcome the Australian's Margin Call editor, Will Glasgow. Will, was it a late one for you?
Yeah, I'm a bit dusty, actually.
So who was who in the zoo?
Well, look, John Howard was there as the keynote speaker, right? So
in his 80th year?
Turns 80 in July.
Yes.
And so the perfect guest for Gerard Henderson's 30th black tie knees up for the Sydney Institute. And because Howard was the speaker, it really was quite an amazing Liberal crowd who are along.
I thought for him it was a pretty awesome performance. I mean, he is 80 and he appeared not even to look down at his notes.
Yeah,
really.
I don't think, it's become a bit of a trademark of his, not using the notes. And yeah, obviously still very comfortable speaking, and probably put a bit more time into his speech than maybe in some of the other keynotes we've seen in
And of course he had Gladys Berejiklian's victory, which was back in...
He did, and you know, he had his fingerprints all over that. He was so key in those national seats that they held, and also Stuart Ayres' seat out in Penrith, which they held. He was kind of key to pushing back some of those challenges on the right. So yeah, he was sort of praising her, and she was the other sort of fated guest in the room last night as well.
Who else was there?
Well, yeah, her predecessor Mike Baird was there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, his predecessor Barry O'Farrell. We've got a few former Liberal premiers now, but he was there as well. And then Maurice Payne from the Foreign Minister and her partner Stuart Ayres, the Minister, who's waiting to find out what his spot will be in Gladys Berejiklian's new cabinet, which she'll decide probably over the weekend. Probably learn that on Sunday or Monday before the budget. Bizoids, yeah, you had, well, you know, Mike Baird again with his NAB hat on.
with all his infrastructure recycling stuff all coming through.
I mean, it was at the start, so John O'Neill wouldn't miss it, the chair.
Yes, I saw Matt Beckier there.
Beckier was there as well, and yeah, you know, the great and good. So.
All right. So that was a pretty big night. Now, down in Melbourne, on the Labor side of things, there seemed to be another sort of party going on.
Well, there was. I mean, so in the Sydney Institute room, because of, I think, Gladys Berejiklian's win, there was quite a sort of oddly enthusiastic, upbeat room, really, for a party that's on the cusp of probably being decimated at the upcoming federal election, right?
Yes.
Down in Melbourne, it was the reciprocal event at Anthony Pratt's house, his
his private home.
Yeah, it was the night of Bill Shorten's Labor fundraiser at the Pratt residence. Now, that's a residence that Bill Shorten's spent a bit of time with. His previous wife, Deb Beale, used to go around there a lot, was very close to the Pratt family. Now, he's been away. Bill Shorten hasn't been there for quite a few years, but last night was sort of the prodigal son's return, as he's now on the cusp of being
the expectation that he is Prime Minister.
So he was along with about half of his shadow cabinet, Richard Dreyfuss, Tanya Plibersek.
And Anthony Pratt, a pretty important fellow, both in terms of his relationship with Donald Trump, you know, one of our Australians that has one, and also the whole trade thing with America.
Big trade thing, big investor as well, and you know, part of a family that's well known for its political pragmatism, as are a lot of the Melbourne billionaires. I mean, they really are not, they're not Liberal or
that's
Labor.
Part of the reason they got there.
Well, that's exactly right. So you had also along there, you had Harold Mitchell, who's another very pragmatic kind of guy who will, you know, find things to work. He had a good relationship with Tony Abbott, for example, but now he's also got a good relationship with Bill Shorten. He's just one of these figures who'll work with government and work with centre governments, as he'd see it. Andy Penn was also along, the Telstra CEO.
Oh, really?
So, you know, quite an interesting group. And look, the word from the room is Shorten was very comfortable. There was some people who were along at that event, and then the Liberals event at Raheen, a similar fundraiser 2 weeks ago. Now, Anthony Pratt missed that one. He was overseas on business. Now, he did not miss last night's. He was very much there. He was opening, you know, on the door to welcome guests as they came in.
I wonder if there was any talk about writing down the NBN for Andy Penn.
Well, yes.
So, look, how do we think it's going to shape up, you know, come this election campaign now? Do you think there has been a lot more schmoozing with Labor in the lead up to the...
Oh, there sure has been, no doubt about it. I mean, the Labor functions, you know, they're noticing they're able to charge more money, and they're able to extend, you know, fundraisers are being expanded to bigger spaces because they need more capacity. We wrote in the column this week, Bill Shorten's, his campaign's booked his party for, well, they think May 11 or May 18, depending which it'll be. They've booked the hotel out by the Essendon Airport, which is owned by Lindsay Fox and Max Beck. They've helped out with some special rates there for Bill Shorten's, but that's a bigger space than they had last time, because the expectation is they're going to have to fit a lot more people in that room. And getting the same, I think we'll see the same thing at Budget Week next week, where Bill Shorten's right of reply is going to be at the after parties going to be at the Canberra Convention Centre, which is sort of 2-3 times bigger than the room they had last year, because the expectation is they'll be able to sell a lot of tickets. So.
Oh boy, gotta love a party. It's going to be a very big week next week.
Yeah,
Glasgow. Thank you very much. All right, well, that's all for the show tonight. Tomorrow night, ASIC Chairman James Shipton. Thanks for your company.